Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're just going to begin now. I'm going to, yeah. I would like to start by acknowledging that the Black Arts Center is located on the unceded and stolen lands of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kaikat, and Swasin First Nations peoples. These lands were acquired through state-sanctioned genocide and violence against indigenous peoples that is continuously evolving and still exists today. It is important to say this because we are on these lands, and this land gives us food, water, life, and our collective material realities are intrinsically tied to this land and its stewards. I am an immigrant, and when I moved here and started university at SFU, indigenous history was never taught to me. I never heard the traditional names of the territories, not in class, not in media. And I moved through this land ignorant of what it meant to be here. When I also moved here, I was away from family, and there was a distance that I felt that made day-to-day life very hard. And I had to kind of recreate the notions of family around me. This show is about family, and it is important to engage with such a topic while actively acknowledging how colonization and white supremacy has caused displacement and erasure of the family histories of the many and varied indigenous peoples who call this land home. My name is Hafiz Akinlusi. I am one of the co-directors of the Black Arts Center and the curator of the exhibition Family First, which is on display now and part of Capture Photography Festival.
Thank you, Hafiz. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrea Fatona, and I am the principal investigator working collaboratively with BLAC, meaning Moroti, Hafiz, and Maira Castro. I want to welcome you here today. I want to just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm also an immigrant to this country, and I come from a long line of free Yoruba people from Nigeria, as well as enslaved folks from Jamaica. So I come to this space as an ally with regards to indigenous sovereignty, as well as an ally to all those seeking freedom and spaces of sovereignty. So this project, Case Study 3, explores labor history as well as family histories. But before we get to that, we'd like to actually give you a walking tour through the exhibition first. So I'm going to hand it back over to Hafiz to give us that walkthrough. Thank you.
Yes. So before I do the walkthrough, going through the different works and the artists and what it's about, I just want to say a couple things about the show. So Family First is about, well, is about the different dynamics that exist within Black families beyond the veil, that go beyond the veil of performance we put on for outsiders. So when I was thinking about the show and wanting to curate the show, I thought a lot about my own relationship to my family and the relationships that my friends have to their families, and how the notion of putting your family first is something that I heard a lot as a kid, but the question that kind of keeps coming up in my head is at what cost? What is the cost of putting my family first? And how do these family dynamics like result in erasure of certain identities and allow for the growth of certain identities and certain ways of being? The show is about a lot of things. It's about memory, it's about time, it's about distance, both spatial and temporal, and how we navigate this distance as Black people living in the diaspora. The show being in Surrey is really relevant. Surrey is home to the largest population of Black people in BC, many of who are first, second, or third generation immigrants who landed here for various reasons. And because of that distance from family, have had to kind of construct new ways of being or construct new identities of family. And the show is just about asking these questions about what does a family look like? What does it mean to be part of a family? What does it mean to like your family? What does it mean to create exactly to not like your family? And how do you navigate all the in-between? Is it possible for us to end the performance? And what happens if we end the performance? I have a lot of questions, don't have a lot of answers, and a lot of the artists' work have made me feel things. They were all very effective, and I think that's like really important to me when curating. This is the first time I'm curating a show ever, so I guess, yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I will go into, I guess, talking about each of the artists and their work. So this work on display on the blue wall is by Jade Duncanson. Jade Duncanson is a visual artist who is based in Vancouver and grew up in Surrey. The work, Jade was actually introduced to me by Moroti, who is our curatorial lead here. And the work that we have on display here is with two sisters who Jade works with and has worked with for a while. And Jade was kind of thinking about, when thinking of family, she thought a lot about her relationship with her sister, because growing up, that relationship was kind of the strongest bond that she had and was really important to her. And when we think of like family dynamics and the emotional currents that go through families, it kind of sometimes results in not as strong bonds with some family members that kind of influence like really strong bonds with others. So the idea behind the images and why I really like the images is because all of it is at the entrance of the house. So you are not going into the home, like it's all at the door frame. You're never actually inside the home. And the idea behind that is to kind of think of this as, to me, I kind of think of it as an opportunity for performance, where like these two girls are performing a mode of like sisterhood that is real, but you don't know what's going on behind the doors. You do not know what is actually going on inside the home, which I think then gives us freedom to imagine whatever we want to, depending on our own references and our own relationships with our families. We kind of project onto the image like different ideas of what is going on, which I think is really interesting. And that idea of the audience's projection onto imagery is something that I'm thinking a lot about when thinking of this show and how memory relates to that as well. There are also little kind of Easter eggs in the photos, like one of the girls is wearing a Jamaica shirt because Jade is half Jamaican, and there's just like certain references in the images that I think if you're Black, you're able to really resonate with and understand why this is so important, why the relationship between her and her sister and hair care is really important. I really love the images, and I hope you enjoy them too. Next up is this 6-channel video by Chukwudubem Ukaigwe. Chukwudubem is a really good friend of mine. Like, I really like his work. He is a multidisciplinary artist. His work kind of spans between video work, paintings, honestly any medium you can think about. Sorry, I have some notes here. The video work interweaves like ambient and evanescent images of African life with images of Black Canadian families having dinner, and kind of shows the solidarity that exists across this space, across like the space of being in Africa and being in Canada, eating dinner with your family. I also think of how much of Black Canadian life is tied to not so distant histories of being immersed in that African and Caribbean world, and how Black families attempt to bring parts of this or parts of this existence with them when we live here. Like when I live here, like what do we bring with us to like remind us of the family that we've left, and the distance that exists between us and like our families back home. The video work was originally on CRT monitors. It's always been displayed on CRT monitors. But for this show, I wanted to do it on these monitors kind of in this like circular form, because I was thinking of the non-linear nature of time and also about revolutions and like space and the earth. And then there's a form of a Ghana must go bag, which in West Africa is like used, it's like heritage, like this bag, it's used for traveling, it's used for going across long distances, and I think it just ties the work really well together and helps ground the work in this idea of movement and like the non-linear nature of time. And like I know the images and the videos of like daily life in Africa, in like different parts of Africa. I remember someone was asking about like, oh, what does this have to do with family? I'm like, when I see these images, it reminds me of my family. Like when I see these images, they remind me of home in such a visceral way that is really hard to describe. And I just wanted to show that and hope that people would connect to that as well. Yeah, it's really beautiful work. I stared at this for 30 minutes at a time, which was really nice. And yeah, it kind of feels like how my memory works sometimes, where like I think about things and they're not static, it's always moving. And how little things can kind of trigger memories of like a whole world outside of where I am. Like I can eat plantain at a dinner table and I'm like, whoa, like this reminds me of Lagos. Moving on from Chukudubem's work, up next on this wall, we have the work by Dion Squires. Dion Squires is an artist based in Toronto whose work mainly deals with photography. It's all photographic work. This work was part of a series of images that he made into a book called, like a digital book called Right Here, Right Now. These are images of him and his mom just spending time together. And when we talked about the images, something Dion said that really stuck with me was about like this idea of notches and mark making, and how like when you think of like notches and mark making, when kids grow up, like usually in houses you have like different marks for the height, and for him these photos are his own way of making marks in time of the time that he spent with his mother. This is his version of that. And he was kind of saying that he took these photos when he was 21, and his only regret was that he only started this when he was 21. And the idea is to kind of monumentalize like the ordinary, like very mundane things that he did with his mom, or he does with his mom, kind of hold a lot of weight. And I really resonate with that. I feel like when I think of my family, it's really the mundane. Like it's not like someone's birthday or like something really special. It's just the mundane, and the mundane kind of like holds a lot of weight and is very special. And I think kind of making monuments out of the mundane is really important, and kind of why it's important, I don't have the words for the moment, but it just is. Yeah, it's also part of a present archive. So this is archival work. Like this is kind of part of a long history of archive making, and the images, kind of similar to other images in this space, have references in there that feel very personal to me, despite them having nothing to do with my own personal experiences. Like the image of him, his mom, like working on the meat in the kitchen. I don't even need to go into that. It's very real. Like these images feel very real and kind of combat this idea of like a family that is very, I don't say non-dysfunctional, but this like idea of like a very normative family that involves like the dad, the mom, and the two kids, and is like very nuclear and like works in a specific way, which most families don't work in. And Yeah, and then looking at this work and some of Jay's work, something that I think about is the focus on hair care. Um, if you look at some of the images here, they kind of mirror some of the images there with those two sisters taking care of each other's hair. It's Dion and his mother taking care of each other's hair. And I think there's a lot of, when we think of care, like especially for Black people, hair is like a really central part of that. It's a really intimate thing to allow someone touch your hair and take care of your hair. And I think it's interesting to see how for Dion, that relationship is with his mother, and for Jade, that is with her sister. And kind of thinking of what dynamics resulted in that world for them. It's cool for me to think about. The next part I would like to talk about is the kitchen / dining table. So this is I included this because I really wanted to have something in the space that the viewer or audience could interact with, like something that you could sit down with and kind of engage in some of these rituals that families engage in, like that result in familial bonds being made. I think the dining table or the kitchen table is like such a central figure in the home. There's different artists that have kind of like talked about the kitchen table. One that comes to mind is Kerry Williams with the kitchen table series, which, yeah, like it's really iconic work. And for me, when I think of the kitchen table, like I think of how much goes on this item. Like this item, which is just a piece of furniture, is kind of a conduit for like everything in between. Like you work here, you play here, you have discussions, you tell stories here, you share food here. And depending on also like your familial structure and like class, the dining table and the kitchen table either acts as something where you do everything in, or a space that you rarely ever touch. You only touch this on very specific occasions that require the whole family to engage in this type of performance, which I think is also really interesting to think about. So with the games on the table, the idea is for people to engage with this, like sit down, play checkers with someone who might be a friend, who might be a stranger. I find that when people engage in these games, you kind of build relationships really quickly, and actively without the pressure of or like the awkwardness that usually comes with that. So you're able to kind of really experience what it feels like to build these bonds and like have disagreements and compete with each other, which is something that exists a lot in families, and is sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken. We also on the table have some objects which are archival from Vanessa Fajemison's family archives. So these are envelopes which had letters that her mom and grandmother used to send to each other when she first migrated here from Nigeria, then to Venezuela, and then to Canada. So these letters are all at least 2 decades old. And when Vanessa brought them into the space, something I've been thinking a lot about is that migration and that distance and time, and like how these objects, like these materials, which are not pictures, hold a lot of memory in them as well, and hold a lot of importance in them. I have a lot more to say about the kitchen table, and I think it's like a really important piece of furniture and goes beyond furniture. But I'll hold off for now. Thank you for listening to me so far. Also, when this is over, play checkers. It's really fun. Next up, unfortunately our lights are out, but the work that we have on display here is by Delali Kofi, which includes work from 2019 and some work from 2023. So the work from this is all part of a bigger project called Place of Ours, where Delali has been documenting just daily life in Ghana. Delali lives here now. He lives in Toronto, and since he moved to Toronto and has been going back to Ghana, he's been taking pictures of his family just in their daily life. So these pictures he took in 2019, and the interesting thing is, after 2019, he didn't go back home until 2023. And in 2023, he went home and took this picture of his sister and wrote this poem that goes with this picture. And the poem very, very accurately describes what it feels like to leave your home and come back, and like the change, and like how like people exist statically in memory. Like when I think of my friends that I haven't seen in 5 years, they are the same people, but those people do not exist anymore, and how that change can be really hard to come to terms with, and how like an image just holds things. Like an image is static, almost in the same way that memories are static, but they're also windows into like different worlds. The images also, I really appreciate them because of the flowers. The flowers are, I know these flowers really well. These images were taken in Ghana, but I'm Nigerian, and these flowers, I see them in everyone's house in Nigeria. When I look at the images, I wish I was there. And there's this distance that I cannot close. Like, no matter how great these images look and how much I resonate with them, I am not there, and I will not be able to experience this. And there's a kind of grief that I feel when I look at these images. When I look at a lot of these images, and I'm just like kind of asking a lot of questions about what it means to not have your family within reach. Like, what does that mean? How does that change the dynamic when you go back home? Finally, I would like to talk about Iris's images. Sorry. So these images are by Iris Hongbo. Iris is a multidisciplinary artist who grew up in Surrey and still lives here. When I was talking to her about family, she talked a lot about how when she thinks about her family and what resonates with her, it is not pictures of her parents or her siblings. It is the materials that her grandmother left her. So the traditional cloth and the older pictures of her when she was a kid. Because of Iris's gender identity, there has been like a rupture in like that relationship between like her birth parents and her birth family. So like this is how she holds on to family, is herself and these materials and her ancestors and her grandmother and her younger self. So when I think of like this image of like Iris on top of younger Iris, it's almost like she's holding herself up, and like thinking of that memory and time, it's like I imagine her as a younger person would like be so comforted by the idea of who she ended up being and like what she grew up to be. And I think there's a lot of questions that come up here about what a family is what is a family meant to be? Like if a family is meant to keep me safe and I don't feel safe around my family, what happens then? And can we fix that? Do we need to fix that? What comes next? Like how do we then, beyond this, like create spaces for safety? How can we push the boundaries of what and the limits of what a family is? Because a family should not be static. A family should be fluid. A family should be ever changing. And yeah, there's a sound piece that goes with this work that we'll play at different intervals throughout the evening. But that brings us to the end of my tour for the Family First show. And now I will pass it on to Moroti, Andrea, and Maira to talk about case study 3.
Where's Maira? New position. We need to be over here. We need to be on that side. Good. Hi, everyone. So now we're going to talk about case study 3. Case study 3 explores the connection between the histories and patterns of settlement in Surrey and Vancouver. It also focuses on Black people's engagement in the labor force, utilizing the archives of SFU, Emily Carr, the City of Vancouver, the City of Surrey, VIVO, and most importantly, family collections. Our project seeks to document and commemorate the histories of Black participation in this area. The project also focuses on what isn't present in the archives and aims to fill the existing gaps pertaining to Black livingness as articulated and discussed by Catherine McKittrick. The following questions guide our research activities. A, how are Black communities formed and sustained in relation to access to the labor force? B, how is Black people's engagement in the labor force documented and represented in the official archives? And C, who collects and describes the materials in the archives? A core activity in this project is the development of other ways to describe the material that exists in the archives. But I want to say as well, this project also is really thinking about diasporic movement, diasporic connections across time and space. And much of the work that we've had to do this is really sleuthing through a number of archival spaces, but family collections. The other thing we've had to do is also create a narrative for ourselves and these genealogical charts, which Maira will talk about later, as well as Moroti will talk about the process of collecting with community to fill out the absences in the archives. The research is really also grounded and started in terms of the ability to think through what is here and what is in the archives. It's based on a video documentary made by Cornelia Weingarten and myself in 1993. It's called Hogan's Alley. And Hogan's Alley documents the previously unrecorded histories of Vancouver's Black community, specifically Hogan's Alley, between 1930 and the 1960s. The tape examines the lives of 3 Black women, and I'll name them, because part of this project as well is to really talk about the importance of naming in relationship to memory work and in terms of grounding ourselves within specific geographies and across specific geographies. So the women in the videotape, Thelma Gibson was an African Caribbean dance teacher who recalls the era that we documented with nostalgia. Pearl Brown was a well-known local jazz singer who speaks about working in the chicken houses, which were the only, one of the few places that Black women were employed at that time based on the notion of anti-Black racism. And then we had another woman, Leah Curtis, who was a lesbian in her mid-40s, who talked about the history of that space and talked about her own positionality with regards to being an abused child and the kinds of support that she got within that area, within that community, I'm sorry. So due to racism and exclusions from the larger society, Black people developed their own unofficial economies. And those economies were really also run or focused on what was called chicken houses, which were Black-owned restaurants that actually were in houses themselves. They were unofficial. Black women also worked as domestic workers. Many of them worked as waitresses in these Black-owned businesses. So there's a relationship between the work we've done on this project with the larger project looking at women's labor history, looking at the hotel and restaurant and entertainment union. But what we see in this project is that Black women weren't involved in places like the HREU. What we find is that we have organizations like the BCAACP, which I think it started in 1958 with people like Rosemary Brown, who we'll talk about later, as being one of the founders. And that organization, which is a community organization, became the advocacy group for Black people in terms of education, in terms of work, and in terms of the legal system. So what we've really found in this research is that there are many gaps. And having been at the conference to a number of sessions over the last couple of days, those gaps don't exist solely for Black people. We see that they exist for women, we see that they exist for Indigenous people, we see that they exist for people with disabilities. So part of this project as well is also making me realize that there's a conversation to be had in the now with these groups based on the histories of exclusion and based on the kinds of, I think, strategies that have been developed across these other communities of folks seeking equity and seeking inclusion. So at this moment in time, I see that there's really a need for much more conversations across these supposedly disparate spaces. I'm hoping that our Crossing Fonds project will also enable that kind of engagement across these archival records so that we can develop a much more, I would say, holistic and inclusive understanding of the narratives and histories of this place. The other thing that we found, I also want to just say a little bit about this wall in terms of the presentation, the materiality of this work. I want to say that in terms of diasporic engagement, this idea of taking the archive out to community is not my idea. This idea has come from my deep work with the recovery project from Black History Month Florence in Italy. And so again, it's also, I want to just point out the kinds of nodes and connections that we make across space and time to enable Black history and Black diasporic history to come into focus. So taking the archive out, what we wanted to do was sort of deprivilege the kind of lack of access to these objects. So we've printed the work also on newsprint. We've exploded the work as well as a way for people to actually have a little bit more of intimacy with the work, but also using newsprint as well in terms of what that might register to us about dissemination, about a kind of democratizing and popularizing the kind of information involved here. I also want to just, before I pass this on to Moroti and to Maira, to really thank the Black Arts Center and actually these three people standing here with me. We started this collaboration 2 years ago, and it's been slow, it's been difficult, but it's also been incredibly fulfilling. And what I want to say is the kind of work that we need to do about archival recovery and making the archive possible requires this kind of slow work. It requires building trust amongst us as collaborators, and I have to say that in the end, and given this amazing exhibition we've done, that it proves that the type of slowness and the type of work that has to be done, but also the kinds of mistakes that one has to make in order to come to what has to be done is also quite important in the process of doing this work and in the process of doing work with community. So I'm going to pass this on, the mic on to Moroti to talk about the ways, to talk about the strategy that was used to collect information from community in order to present this exhibition.
Thank you all for being here. Like Andrea said, my name is Moroti George. I am the curatorial lead of BLAC and this project. For BLAC's contribution to Crossing Fonds and Case Study 3, Hafiz and I and the entire BLAC team were really thinking about aligning ourselves with BLAC's mandates, our own understanding of the archive, and BLAC's mandate is to engage with Black youths and like to create a space for Black artistic production in general, but with specific focus on Black youths who tend to leave Surrey to Vancouver to explore their artistic agency. So we find ourselves asking questions about why not Surrey? How do we keep ourselves grounded in Surrey? How do we build that idea of Surrey centrism, as Hafiz says? But with that being said, we were really focused on Black youth. We were kind of like thinking about how to create a sense of importance with the archive and a connection with the archive with Black youths. And the way that we decided to do this was to have an archive digitization workshop here in the Black Arts Center and also in the Vancouver Black Library VBL, which is in Vancouver, which also kind of ties to the general premise of this project, looking at the connections and migrations of Vancouver, between Vancouver and Surrey in the Black community. So during these workshops, we kind of had a specific ask. We asked people to bring objects. We were very liberal with what we were saying people should bring, but we still, it was fun. But we we also asked ourselves, especially me, who went to art school, who has a very, I tend to know what I want, and I try and like milk. I shouldn't say that. I try and like hope that my plans go as I plan them. But we had a specific ask. We kind of became liberal. We were like anything, newspaper clippings, anything that speaks to your blackness and like which you kind of think should be stored. And then people came, and we had some scanners, courtesy of Karen from VIVO and some members of the Grant Gallery, to digitize people's archives. The first thing we noticed was that like a lot of people really didn't bring objects that could be digitized, which really raised the questions pertaining to how has digitization become like a very important collecting practice within our general archival collecting practice, and what are the limits of digitization itself. So we started like thinking of other ways to create a bond with one another, to kind of speak to like archival collecting practices. And I asked people who came to the workshops if they knew what an archive was, what they think an archive can do, what they think an archive cannot do. And I asked them if they have ever visited an archive, what they think constitutes an archive. And most of the responses we got were very fascinating. Some individuals were telling us that like, oh, they don't think that like people in Vancouver want to know about what their mom was doing in the 1960s. Other people were saying that like, oh, their parents would not want their items in an archive, and all of that kind of stuff. But in general, I think that one benefit that this archive collecting workshop and like this practice that we did was kind of build community. When Andrea and I were debriefing after, she kind of gave me a little spank on my hand, telling me that like, this is long work. I can't kind of like expect it. It's relationship building. And I think that that's something that should be considered generally in collecting practices, especially within the Black community, who have very valid reasons not to trust institutions and like have their questions about what an institution can do in the benefit of Blackness. And we generally came to the conclusion that like this would be a long project. This is something that we would have to do in the long run, and this is about relationships, period. But like in addition to that, this project, even as it's had its like ups and downs, it really showed what the institution cannot hold, first of all, but it also really worked to remediate and corroborate most of the findings in that Maira and Andrea found in the institutional record. But like it also helped us to speculate a bit more about what Blackness in Vancouver could be and what is possible for us. Like Andrea already talked about the privileging the archive with the materiality we chose, but for the Black Arts Center's contribution to case study 3, I chose specifically to focus on Kentish Steele because I found his story very fascinating, and it really just helped me think about what the family album and the personal family archive can how it kind of transgresses into the collective and into the diasporic, and kind of helps us make sense of our collective cultural histories and impacts in this place that we call so-called Vancouver. So Kentish Steele was a very fascinating man. He's still alive, I'm so sorry. We got access to his archive through his daughter, Rita. Thank you so much, Rita. I told her hi, I think she'll be in the live stream. And Rita came from one of the workshops, and she brought a bunch of things. It was kind of funny. She just came in and she was like, yeah, I just took all this from my dad's house and I think it'll be cool. So Kentish was a student at UBC. and he kind of started a band called the Chantels, where he played music in the 60s and in the early 60s to late 70s, and was kind of and he was the frontman of the band, which was majority white, and he played in a dance club. The name skips my mind, but it was popping from the images that we could see. And it was really fascinating to me looking at these images because in our conversations, Hafiz, Maira, and Andrea and I were really thinking about how a very visible aspect of Black Canadian and Black Vancouverite history is through like our impacts in the cultural and entertainment history sectors, but also thinking about the limits of those sectors and how it kind of like frames us as Black people. But it also is interesting seeing how much agency this man had in his career to some extent, how much impact he was able to have on the landscape, and how he decided to just move on with his life and how he was open to experiments. We kind of see him move from being a frontman at the Chantels to kind of having an on-stage acting career. I chose to feature the poster of Jesus Christ Superstar because I really love Andrew Lloyd Webber and his work. He's so great. And I also love Philip Glass. And in that production in Vancouver, he played the role of Judas Iscariot. And I decided to combine the poster for the production with a fragment from his journal because it really spoke to me on how he is choosing to remember himself and like remember the things that he has done, and he just in general has like had a very fascinating career. At the end of as he grew more mature, he decides to run for mayor of Vancouver, which is something that I double checked and like it was something that happened, but like it's something that we really didn't know. And I decided to put his attempts to run as mayor and like how he was speaking about it in very close conversation with Rosemary Brown and her writing and her family tree, because it helps me think of what else could be, what else is possible, and just the general conversation of like the political impact that Black Vancouverites and Black Canadians in general could have had if not for the things that racism and many other things. So yeah, this is the life of Kentish Steele. As we move forward, we are generally thinking about what else could be. Again, the limits of digitization, where specifically I and like the Black team are specifically thinking of Black in the family album, which is an archive in itself. What are the collecting practices of the family album? What are things that like Black Canadians and Black people across the diaspora find important to understanding and to understanding their lives and commemorating their impacts, and how can we use all of these to corroborate and like to complement and fill in general the gaps to the institutional archive? How can the individual transgress into the realm of the political and the collective? Maira.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am so excited of sharing with you a sample of what we had done for case study 3. So since we wanted to learn more about the dynamics and the labor practices of Black people in Vancouver and Surrey, in Vancouver, specifically in Hogan's Alley, since this was the community or neighborhood where most Black people lived, everything in this wall started with that picture on top. This picture we found this picture at the City of Vancouver Archives, and also in its description we can find the name of the 4 people from right to left. So with Karen Knight, case study 1, she inspired us and encouraged us to go through the BC Royal Museum of BC to get some viral statistic records. So I just wanted to say and mention Karen because I think it's important to highlight the internal collaborations between cases. But moving forward, in these files, for example, since we learned that the man at the right side of the picture was Herbert Carter, we found his registration of death. And then in this file, we learned that he actually has another daughter who was Erika, and she was the one who signed this registration. So that's it. That allowed us to start building this family tree map. And then with, again, curate nice facilities and passwords, we get to newspapers.com, and we're able to get their obituaries. And then more names were revealed. So as you can see in this picture, there are only 5 people. The 2 ladies in there are Herbert Carter's daughter, and the 4th man, the 4th person is he was married Beatriz, the one that is the 3rd person in this picture. So it is important to say that also we learned that Mr. Carter worked as a sleeping car porter, and Beatriz, she worked as a waitress at Vice Chicken and Steak. So we were able to find so much information, including their address, where they lived, the kind of job they did, and even some social events like this one. You may engage a little bit later. So if you would like to engage a little bit more with the methodology we use for this case, we created this narrative way. It's like a non-traditional way to describe a methodology for a research or case study. It's just a poem, so you're so welcome to engage a little bit more with this. Then we wanted to do the same in Surrey, and since the Scott is like a very famous family who lived in Surrey in something between the middle to the late 1800s, we couldn't find any files like those from the BC Royal Museum or any newspaper clippings, except something like this one that is a newspaper clipping from 2018. So it's pretty contemporary. I really wanted to know how from this information, we built this family tree, but I wanted to go deeper and learn how they actually knew this information to get to this, but there is no files available. And I believe or argue that in order to claim or reclaim our identity and advocacy, those files should be available for everybody. We learned, talking about advocacy, we learned about Rosemary Brown, who was a very influential woman in Vancouver. She's coming from Jamaica. She used to do a very remarkable job advocating for people in labor, education, housing. Thank you, Andrea. And also she was a politician, so feminism. Thanks for that. Still collaboration between cases. Thank you. So this is a family tree she wrote down thinking it will be read by her grandchildren, which is beautiful. I think it's very intimate. We found this family tree like that at the UBC Rare Books and Collections. And yeah, so in short, it's like the way we could like bridge what will be the installation as Hafiz described, family dynamics, and how their case fit into this installation by getting a big picture of what these families used to do back in the time. So thank you very much.
So we thought we'd just have a quick little discussion between ourselves, and then we'll open up to ask if you have any questions. But really what we want you to do here actually is to get to know each other, to look at the artwork, to look at the documents up here, and to just think about this idea of memory work and what constitutes memory work. What kind of objects we need, what kind of relationships we need, what are the kind of relationalities between us across these different spaces, particularly in relation to this project. But I think it's also important in terms of the kind of larger project about how we're going to be with each other as we are in the present and as we move forward, as well as how does the past help us to actually rethink and understand what we, some of the strategies and ways that we need to be with each other now to ensure a different kind of future. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Hafiz to start, to maybe pose some questions. I mean, I think one of the biggest questions for me, to tell you the truth, is I'm really interested in terms of a discussion between us about what we've learned. Maybe what we've learned about ourselves, what we've learned about our communities, and what we've learned about this kind of intersectional relationship that we're trying to develop between different kinds of archival objects.
I mean, you kind of just asked the the first question. So I think, sorry, I'm holding a lot of things at the moment. Thank you so much. I think for me, when I think about like what this whole experience has been and the relationship between both shows and the idea of like learning, I think when we started this project, something we kind of talked about was like, oh, like outcomes that we were like hoping for. And I remember that Andrea was like, don't think about the outcomes right now, because likely as you experience the work and as you do the research, like things are going to change, and that is when the outcomes will like, you'll get the outcomes that you get. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned was kind of the importance of family archives in relation to community archives, in relation to general archives. Like I think it starts with the family a lot of the time. I think I was listening to Archives and Things, fantastic podcast. The episode with your walk. Melissa's podcast, the episode with Desiree, and it was, it had me thinking quite a lot about like the importance of like connecting with community and what comes out of that, because a lot of the time, like our own familial archives like really contribute heavily to the communal discourse and like what is actually happening within the community. And then questions of why it is so hard to access those family archives. Like when we were doing the archive workshop, something that I noticed was a lot of people came in kind of also unaware of their own family archives. Like I personally, like I grew up in Lagos. I don't know enough about my family as much as I should. I don't know about my family archives, and I think there's a lot that goes into getting that information or getting that knowledge that requires a lot of very, not painstaking, but really intentional relationship building. It takes a lot for someone to dig into their own history, because for me as the researcher, I'm excited about looking at your past. I'm like, oh my God, this is what you were doing 40 years ago. But there's a very different relationship that the person has to their own history and their own past that I think doing this project has had me kind of thinking a lot more critically about, and about how to engage with these archives with more intention and more carefully, and where to go about finding these archives. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of labor. It's actually, I'm sorry, it's so much labor, because you have to kind of connect dots and then email people and get in contact, and sometimes people don't reply you, and it gets really complicated. But at the same time, it's also really important, which is what I've learned. Like, this is so important to the idea of storytelling, the idea of like world building, I think comes a lot from archives, from like being able to look at a history and see yourself in it, allows you to imagine the future more like, I don't know, not concretely, but like, yeah, I feel more grounded. Like looking at Kenji Steele's archives changed the way I looked at Vancouver. It literally like, I look at Vancouver completely differently now. I'm like, oh, a black man ran for mayor here? That is, you know, I'm a lot more interested in my local politics now than I was before. But yeah, like it's, yeah, that's one of the biggest things I've learned is how crucial this work is to world building and storytelling. Yeah.
Okay. In my case, I would like to say that just recently I defended my thesis. I am. Thank you very much. I am from Colombia, so I define myself as Afro-Colombian woman. So while I was doing my thesis, I also was working for Case Study 3. And again, I had so much opportunity to learn about blackness. So what could mean blackness mean in Colombia and also in Canada, right? So black people in America are in America because of the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade. So before that, the main concept of blackness I had is the one that I brought with me, is my background, but then engaging in cases like this, in which I had the opportunity to learn closer about this family, for example, just gave me an idea of how their life was in Canada, at the same time of how the black people in Colombia lived more or less in the same window of time. Was completely different, and it was pretty enriching, right? So I believe that is a great opportunity for me, is having engaged in this case study, because again, it just expanded my perspective of what means being a black person.
Hi again. I think what this project for me did was it kind of contributed to just this ongoing thought I have about black life after like the great disaster. And this is something I think about with regards to like the transatlantic slavery and slave trade and colonization in Africa. And I'm thinking about how like in like most mythology, in most like religion and theological stories, there's like a great flood myth and all of that kind of stuff. And I think about like great disasters of blackness. And in Vancouver, our great black disaster was like the destruction of Hogan's Alley and the forced migration of several black people to other parts of Canada. And like typically there's just this thing that is not really said, but like is like the general inference that like black life ended after in Vancouver, ended after Hogan's Alley ended. And this project helped me to think more about like, and I know that resilience has become like a buzzword to like associate with blackness and has its implications. But I'm thinking about just the strength and like the resilience of like black people to still be here, the new wave of blackness that came in after Hogan's Alley was destroyed, and how they're like remembering themselves, how they're kind of like embedding themselves into these lands and building their own like histories and families and their own like ways of being here, kind of thinking about continuing on and being present in the cultural landscape of this place beyond Hogan's Alley, while we still continue to remember what was like taken from us in a sense. Another thing that this project has taught me is to kind of think about I'm a curator, so like I like to think about the aesthetics and like the aesthetics that are also like kind of embedded into the banal and the mundane of black life. And like when I found that like even when I think about like images picturing mundane Black life, I have an expectation of what it should aesthetically look like, which is just like I don't even know what's wrong with me. But like I am kind of thinking a lot more about like how banality and like the mundane like kind of finds itself in a frame, how it is documented, how we can communicate being in this place and just simply being. We don't need to do too much. And even when we're literally being like in like when we see a mundane image, there's so much that we can tell about like history and place just from like two people standing in front of a building, which is something that we saw in the archive workshop. One of the participants brought an image of her and her mother about to go out for a birthday party, and it was very cute, but like very like okay. And then we started talking about how like the building they were standing in front of was like social housing, and how it is now getting destroyed. And it is social housing where a lot of Black and brown members of the community live. So even in that banal image, there is still a lot of like politics tied to it and all of that kind of stuff. The last thing is, while I was working on this project, I was also working on I'm sorry. Well, I was also working on another archive project of the Vancouver area network of drug users and like curating an exhibition based off their archive. And it's funny because like I spoke to you about it when you came, but like in that archive, which it in itself kind of exists as like a family album, I found like so many traces of Blackness and like so many like Black people in the archive of like the Vancouver area network of drug users. And I was like, this is interesting. This is like an important part of like cultural like engagement and like Black people in Vancouver's cultural landscapes. And I think that like what that taught me and like in relation to this project is to try and find connections where you think the connections might not exist. Like it's very important now more than ever with the stakes of everything. There are so many stakes for everything. It's time that we kind of like embody being dissident, embody like guerrilla methods of doing these things, kind of thinking about more than like writing, like telling stories, but like kind of embodying like a praxis of like moving beyond the like the stoic and academic, but like just like a general praxis of like engagement that is like decolonial, dissident, and like very much rooted in community engagement. So yeah, that's all.
So I wanted to say what I've learned from this project is numerous things, but the one that sticks out for me is, well, first of all, just sort of preface it and say 3 of us standing here are of Nigerian descent, which is really interesting. Myself, Hafiz, Moroti, Maira is Afro-Colombian. But I actually spent much of my my mid-20s to 30s in Vancouver, and actually, you know, came back and forth. I didn't actually hang out in Surrey or New Westminster, so Vancouver was the place. But at the time I got to Vancouver, what the demographics was like in terms of Blackness is that there were a number of folks who migrated here as some of the first settlers from the prairies, originally from the States, places like Oklahoma. And then there were a really good group of folks who were from the Caribbean, right? So, and now what I've learned is that I'm looking at the global flows and movement and migrations of people globally in this moment. And at this time, what I'm seeing is that there's a really high population of African folks coming from the continent, which says a lot about global politics. It says a lot also about the ability for particular kinds of African subjects to also move. And that's also, you know, there's a bit of, you know, we've got African folks from the continent moving here because they can move, right? They've got the funding, they come from classed positions, and there are other folks who are moving here who actually are coming in here seeking refuge, which is a very different kind of Vancouver and Lower Mainland that I actually was part of when I got here. So what I've learned is actually the fact that, again, the cultures change, where people come from change, and that actually shapes the kind of culture that we see in the moment here. Right now, particularly in Surrey, the African influence is much stronger than, I would say, the Caribbean influence that I knew when I was here, and a lot stronger than the kind of settlement history. But what this project's brought to me is that we actually need to collect all of these histories, because they integrate, they create particularly hybrid types of cultures that we actually engage in. And so it's, again, this idea that things change, things move, there are flows, and those flows actually create different kinds of cultural spaces. And so the space of Vancouver now and the space of Surrey now is much different than the space that I knew in the 80s and 90s. I want to actually, we were going to have another question, but I actually feel that if there's any questions on the floor or through Zoom, that we should take that and just give people the space to actually speak with each other.
Is that working? Yeah, hello. So first of all, how brilliant. I mean, really, how brilliant. And, Hafiz taking us through the show, just amazing, like incredible, and Moroti, incredible, and Maira, amazing, and of course, Andrea. I have a question about working with family archives. In my experience, as a historian and with some history working with those archives, families are very, very, very messy. And, there's issues around queer identities, there's issues around political divisions, there's what people do to other people within the family. So I'm really interested in hearing, and in diasporic families and in families that have been particularly victimized by historical circumstances, it's amplified. So what are your strategies to manage that as you go forward? Like, what are your and because also you evoke pain sometimes when you're collecting family records. So I'd love to hear how you've managed that at this stage, how you managed that in the exhibition, and how you think about this practice going forward. Because it kind of gets posed as a sort of utopian alternative to traditional record keeping, and it has many, many challenges to it.
I agree with you. So there is an ethic. We talked about this in the last workshop that I was at today, this notion of an ethic of care. But I think it's also coming to the practice of realizing that, as you said, there's always conflict. And so I think what we do in this project, and this project is moving forward. So this is the first iteration. We're trying to learn from this. So how do we then support folks? And I think Melissa talked about this today in her workshop. When you work with traumatic situations, how do we create space to allow those difficult conversations to take place? And what I would say in terms of my strategy for doing that is that there is always a larger kind of macro frame that we talk about the context out of which these traumas come from, and so that it doesn't solely reside as completely, because we take these on sometimes as an individual deficiency, right? So that we contextualize things. We also have the kinds of spaces in which we have the kinds of expertise with us, and we haven't got to that place yet, right? But that would be the next iteration when we do these workshops, because we've understood that it's necessary to have support. How do we bring in the right kinds of support, right? That actually doesn't also create this as, again, a space of, no, that creates a space in which we can unpack, we can refer people as well, because we don't always have the types of expertise that needs to be there. So it's about having the right kinds of skill set in the room, in the spaces, and not just in the room, but for the aftercare that might take place, which means, again, it brings us back to this notion that these are slow relationships. These are slow relationships that require a focus on the individual and the community over time. So we don't go into, and this is a conversation Moroti and I had, about this notion of going into our communities because it's ours, right? And so we have access, but be careful of the fact that we actually can also engage in extractivist types of activities, right, which become very negative and destructive for us, for our communities. So to really think about how we approach the subject, not from one of extractivism, but one of trying to develop new knowledge about how we work together.
Thank you. I was going to say for the show specifically, I think it was a learning experience. So one thing I would like to say, which is not everything is for everyone. Like, I think there's a balance that has to be struck between this like need or wants to like showcase something and the reality of what impact that is and who it impacts and why it impacts them. I think there's an awareness of the audience, like who is going to see the show. Like, at the end of the day, it's not just a bunch of black people seeing the show. Even then, like, these are personal stories and like families are really personal. And I think during the experience of curating this, obviously it being my first show, I learned a lot, but I also had to kind of contend with like questions of why I wanted to show certain things or why I wanted to explore certain themes. Because originally I had been like really interested in this, sorry, I don't know why I'm laughing about it, but I was like really interested in this idea of like subverting like the family trope. I was like, yeah, like families are messy. There's this work by, I can't remember his name right now, but he's a Japanese photographer and he did these like series of photos where his family is just like in like a very naturally chaotic state, and that was what I was thinking about. I was like, yeah, like, you know, like the family is messy, like let's go there. And then I started talking to the artist. Like, obviously I'm not the artist, so I wasn't thinking, yeah, like why, like as the artist, it's a very different experience showing that kind of work. So when I started talking to the artist and like started thinking a bit more about the show, I was like, why do I even want to show that now? Like, what is the purpose of showing that? Like, what is the impact and what is the intention here? So I think I slowed down a lot and had to have like very real conversations about what the work means and like why we are showing the work, like what is the intended impact of this. And I think like there was even a moment like where like Moroti Loki checked me. I was like, we're talking about Iris's work and I was like, oh, like I wanted to show this, which wasn't even like traumatic or anything like that, but Moroti just asked me like why are you interested? What are you projecting onto the artist? Are you projecting an idea of what you want the person to show or what the reality of their situation is or what they are comfortable showing? Because dealing with, I think art in general requires a lot of vulnerability, but then art that relates to your own family requires another layer of vulnerability and trust. And I think it got easier with time and like kind of thinking a bit more about the nuance of what a family dynamic is. And then like thinking even about like the archival work, I think really like what grounds me is this idea of like, there's a word or term for it, but just keeping certain things to yourself. Like I don't need to show everyone everything. You'll get hints from the work that might relate to you, and if they don't relate to you in that way, then it's actually not meant to be for you. There's postcards that we did, which I think are somewhere around here, and there was this like playing with this idea of like exclusion and erasure, where there's like open space for you to fill in the blanks, and if you know certain experiences, you know what it means when it's like, you forgot to bring X out of the freezer. That, if you know, you know, exactly, like literally. So I think that was kind of, that's part of this, like when thinking of like dealing with the complex nature of families, like being really aware of my own positionality as, like in this case, the curator, in this other situation, like a researcher, like what is my role here? Who am I giving this work to? What is the point of this? And like putting a lot more trust in the artist or the person whose archives we're exploring. You show us what you want to show us. What you don't want to show us is for you, and there's no pressure to go beyond what you're comfortable with, and being able to sit with that. Yeah.
Okay.
In the interest of time, we're going to move it on to the next question. I think it was Mia.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for such excellent exhibition and presentation. And Andrea, Moroti, Maira, and Hafiz, you all did wonderfully. So Amia, I'm the one to send you like the annoying meeting invitations. So I want to make a comment and then a question. Thanks Hafiz for like such a wonderful tour. It was very emotional. Like I actually cried a little bit at first, and because I relate so much to what you said as like a fellow immigrant in Canada. And my favorite moment, my favorite piece was when you introduced like the letters between like a mother and her daughter. And it's reminded me of like my grandmother and my mother when like 30 years ago when she moved across the country and had to leave away from her mother, from her mother. And yeah, so my question is, I'm curious about like your relationship with the artists of the works here, because I feel like I have the feeling that you have some kind of relationship, but if you don't have the relationship, then like how did you approach, like how did you come to these works and like the artists?
Well, I think, thank you for that. With Jade, it's interesting how it all came together. So with Jade, like me and Jade are friends mostly through Moroti, who's like, I think really like close friends with Jade, which I think opened up like this, like it made the trust easier. And when we talked a lot about the work, like we had like hung out before, like talking about, okay, this is what I want you to show. Like I think because this was my first time, I really approached this like I was just approaching people I wanted to talk to and learn about because I liked their work. And then Moroti was there for some of the conversations, and it was easy to not like build a relationship, but like because I wasn't so obsessed with like the work, like showing the work, it was easy to have these conversations. Me and Chukwudubem have known each other for years, so that was also kind of easy. Like we've talked multiple times about different things, never about me like curating, because this was never, it wasn't like I'm going to be a curator, I'm going to plan on curating. So when he heard I was doing it, he was like, oh my God, I want to be in the show. Yeah, I'm so gassed about that. And then with Iris, me and Iris have also known each other for a couple of years as well. Like it's interesting how this turned out that way. And I really wanted Iris to show work. She had work from before that she had shown like on the internet, but I really wanted her to be a part of this. And we had like conversations over time. Like this whole show came together, I think in curator standards, it's a short period of time. Like we had started talking to the artists in November or October, and it happened, yeah, like in March. So I kind of like had this conversation about this is what I want to show. And I think because of my own identities, it was easier for us to build that connection. Delali, I had been interested in Delali's work because Gloria, a friend of mine, had shown me his work. But then it turns out one of my other close friends is really good friends with him. We just happened to make sense, and he's Ghanaian, I'm Nigerian, and so it just like it was easier, the vibe just made sense, and like we talked, like I think it was just talking to them and trying to be friendly, like and not obsessing over the idea or like the concept. I don't know, I was just really interested in learning about their practices and the work that they were showing. Same thing with Dayon, like I was just like really, when I saw the book, like the digital book for the first time, I was like, whoa, this touched me, and I wanted to know about the person that made this. And it was easy to have these conversations because it felt like we could see each other in certain ways. I think because they're all Black artists and like we all have like kind of certain intersections that made it easier to have that entry point. And I was also sharing, it's like vulnerability begets vulnerability. My friend always says to see is to be seen. So it's like I wanted to see them and they saw me, and yeah, like it allowed for that trust. Yeah, it allowed for that trust.
So I think we'll take 2 more questions, and then we're going to actually really socialize and talk to the curator, talk to the researchers, and also, please, we've got, go to online to see our case study go to the Crossing Fonds Symposium. At the top of the page, you can do a pull down, and you'll see all 3 case studies, but please go to ours and then go to the rest. So we're going to take 2 more questions, because I think really part of this engagement as well is for us to be with each other. And so, over to you.
Hi, I'm Urshi, and I'm currently studying fine art. And it was 3 months ago that I actually learned about the practice of archives and digitization. Something I've been thinking about a lot in my practice and in my community, in my day-to-day life, is gates, barriers, and access. And to think that I learned about archival practices, and I was looking around in this 200-person lecture, and I was the only Black person. So I'm really curious about what you couldn't digitize as you were having that workshop, and what the barriers and gates and access points are for practices of digitization and for archival practices specifically around Black youth, because maybe the points that are not being accessed or the restrictions are actually ideas of boundaries we need to break down or ways we need to rethink archival practice.
Hi, thank you for that great question, Arshi. With regards to what we couldn't digitize, there was a pot, and we can't digitize a pot. We tried to take pictures, but the pot was far away. It was just like, it was a lovely pot that came with this man, and such a great man from Jamaica when he moved to Vancouver, and he passed it on to his daughter. And there were just like a lot of 3D objects. And like this really just like made, like as much as we like to critique institutions, I think that, validly I should add, I think that it's important to also think about the limits that the institutions are also playing with, and like how it becomes our responsibility as we're working outside of these institutions and within them to think about possibility, like what else is possible, what else can we do. When I'm thinking about like access and digitization and the limits of digitization, I think that like a lot of the risks and like the stakes that comes with this project are nothing new if we think about like the histories of like the tradition of oral histories within like Black communities, and like how that exists as a practice of archiving in itself that has been debunked because people are saying that they are unreliable, they give one version of history and all of that kind of stuff. But like it rarely takes into account that the fact that like people experience reality in different ways, that like even as we are like experiencing reality in our own way and like kind of like communicating it in our own way, there is still a basic truth, which is like our presence in like the time. I like to think of this lovely text by Justine Chambers and what's her name, Sika Boyles. I am always Boyce. I am always in this body. And they kind of like call their presence, their simple presence with one another in Vancouver at that time as dancers, as a particular living archive, the practice of being themselves, which is something, dance is a practice that like, it's not easy to, like you can record a dance video, but the affect isn't there. So they are seeing themselves as an embodiment of an archive in itself. And I think that like a lot of the work is going to have to be, unfortunately, saying that like, yo, this is valid, this is real, this is like commemoration, and this is kind of how we gain a better understanding of like just the general stakes and like limits and like actual livingness of Black life in the now, in wherever we're situated. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I mean, as you talked about the fact that you're in the visual arts, I'd actually like to talk about the work of Sandra Brewster. Sandra Brewster is actually a lens-based artist, a photographer, and she's got an exhibition called In Token. And I'm going to read it to you because really what it is about her documenting lens-based, through lens-based, the objects that come from our cultures, particularly Caribbean culture. I think her work really talks about or engages with alternative ways of actually digitizing, starting with the photograph itself. So Sandra Brewster has an exhibition called In Token, and it says, Sandra Brewster represents objects selected and transported from various Caribbean geographies and temporalities, projecting them beyond the private and intimate spaces of their belonging. These objects are belongings, possessions. The deliberate and deliberated presence of these object images bear witness to our movement through time and space. The object themselves function as reminders of where we come from, their value increasing in significance through their transportability, material durability, and sheer and sometimes irrational or inexplicable nostalgia. So one way as well about as actually documenting these objects that we have, where we're not actually trying to do 3D scans, is the simple photograph, and presenting that as a way to actually use these objects that actually carry stories with them. They're actually memory objects, putting that out really in actually 2D form, much like this exhibition does. So I think there are a number of alternative ways that actually sometimes bypass the complexity of doing 3D modeling of objects that actually really resonate for us as diasporic subjects. And I'm going to actually ask us now to just engage with the exhibition and engage with each other. Thank you for being here.